Dust coated the windshield of the green combine, turning the late afternoon sun into a smeared orange bruise. Harlan Kessler squinted through the grime, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, as the John Deere 9500 chewed through the last acres of dry corn. The machine was old, 30 years past its showroom shine, but it was his. He knew its rhythms. He knew the specific high-pitched whine the separator made when it was running slightly too fast, and the low guttural vibration that meant a belt was slipping. Right now it was making a sound it had never made before. A sharp metallic clatter echoed from the engine compartment, followed instantly by a hard shudder that rattled Harlan's teeth. The engine RPMs dropped. The digital display on the corner post, a retrofitted monitor he'd installed himself a decade ago, flashed a sequence of red error codes. E104, fuel delivery failure. Then the massive diesel engine simply died. Silence rushed into the cab, thick and absolute, broken only by the ticking of hot metal cooling in the autumn air. Harlan didn't curse. He didn't pound the steering wheel. He just closed his eyes for a long, heavy second, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back and the dull throb in his right knee. At 72, climbing down from the cab was no longer a fluid motion. It was a negotiation with gravity and deteriorating cartilage. He grabbed his greasy canvas cap from the dash, pulled it low over his thinning gray hair, and pushed the heavy glass door open. The smell hit him immediately. Raw diesel fuel mixed with the dry, dusty scent of pulverized corn stalks and scorched wire insulation. It was an acrid, sharp odor that told him exactly what had happened before his boots even hit the dirt. He walked around to the back of the combine, his boots crunching over the dried stubble. He popped the side panels, groaning as he lifted the heavy steel guards. A wave of heat rolled off the block, instantly pasting his flannel shirt to his chest. He reached into his back pocket for a rag, wiping a layer of oily grit from the fuel injection rail. He traced the lines with a calloused finger, his skin rough as 80 grit sandpaper, feeling for the dampness of a leak. There it was, buried beneath the air intake, nestled in an impossibly tight space against the engine block, was a small black plastic connector. It was the wiring harness for the electronic fuel pressure regulator. The plastic had grown brittle from decades of extreme heat and cold. Engine vibration had done the rest. The connector had sheared clean off, leaving 3 bare copper wires dangling against the cast iron, shorting out the entire fuel system. Harlan let out a breath that was half sigh, half scoff. $70 part, he muttered to the empty field. It was a piece of molded plastic and a few inches of copper. He'd replaced one on his neighbor's machine 5 years ago. You pull the pin crimp, the new wires snap the plastic housing into the receiver, and the computer registers the pressure again. A 30-minute job if your hands weren't too arthritic. He dug into the toolbox bolted to the side of the machine, retrieving a pair of wire strippers, a roll of electrical tape, and a handful of small blue crimp connectors. His hands were thick, the joints swollen, permanently stained with a mixture of grease and soil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He spent 45 minutes leaning over the hot engine block, his ribs bruised against the steel railing, trying to strip the minuscule wires and bridge the gap. Sweat stung his eyes. The smell of diesel gave him a mild throbbing headache. Finally, he got the wires connected. He wrapped them tightly in black tape, securing them away from the hot metal. It was an ugly fix, but a fix nonetheless. He climbed back into the cab, his breathing heavy. He turned the key. The starter ground away a heavy rhythmic churning. Roar, 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 roar. But the engine didn't catch. The digital display blinked again. E104. Unauthorized hardware modification. Engine locked. Harlan stared at the little green screen. The glare of the setting sun made the digital letters look hollow. The computer knew. The resistance in the wires wasn't perfectly calibrated to the factory specifications, or perhaps the newer firmware update he'd been forced to install last spring had a failsafe built in. The machine his machine paid off in cash 25 years ago was refusing to start because its brain didn't recognize a piece of tape and a crimp connector. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. It wasn't just frustration. It was a deep, cynical realization of powerlessness. For 50 years he had bled green and yellow. His first pedal tractor had been a John Deere. His father had driven them. Harlan had bought hats, jackets, toolboxes, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of iron from the company. He had defended them when other farmers switched to red machines. Now his crop was standing in the field, vulnerable to the rain forecasted for tomorrow evening, and he was paralyzed by a few lines of code and a broken piece of plastic. He didn't have a choice. He turned the key back to the off position, pulled the keys from the ignition, and tossed them onto the passenger seat. He climbed down from the dead combine, the silence of the field now feeling less like peace and more like a taunt. He began the long 1.5-mile walk back to the farmhouse to get his truck. Tomorrow morning he would have to go to town. He would have to go to the dealership. And he already knew with a bitter certainty settling in his chest exactly how that conversation was going to go. Gravel crunched under the tires of Harlan's battered Ford F250 as he pulled onto the paved highway leading into town. The morning air was crisp, carrying the damp chill of impending rain. The radio was off. The only sound in the cab was the rattle of loose tools in the truck bed and the squeak of the suspension. 30 minutes later, he pulled into the lot of Prairie Ag Solutions. It used to just be called Miller's Equipment. Old Man Miller used to stand behind the counter with a greasy rag, a pot of burnt coffee, always brewing in the corner. You could bring in a broken gear, drop it on the counter, and Miller would disappear into the labyrinth of wooden bins in the back, returning 10 minutes later with the exact part blowing the dust off it before writing up a paper ticket. Miller sold out to a corporate conglomerate 5 years ago. Now the building was a sprawling monument to modern agribusiness. The exterior was sleek corrugated steel, painted in immaculate company colors. The parking lot was newly paved. The showroom floor, visible through massive plate glass windows, looked like an automobile dealership. Shiny new compact tractors and zero-turn mowers sat on polished concrete, smelling of fresh rubber and industrial cleaner. Harlan parked his rusty truck next to a line of pristine $500,000 combines waiting for delivery. He stepped out, feeling the contrast between his faded denim jacket and the sterile environment. He pushed through the heavy glass doors. The air conditioning was aggressive, chilling the sweat on the back of his neck. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. There was no smell of oil or metal here, just the faint scent of vanilla air freshener and ozone from the laser printers. He walked past a display of expensive branded apparel, $60 hoodies, and $30 baseball caps, and approached the parts counter. It was a long, curved desk made of synthetic wood. Behind it stood a young man in a spotless polo shirt with the corporate logo embroidered on the chest. The kid couldn't have been older than 22. His hands were soft, his fingernails perfectly clean. "Morning. How can I help you today?" the kid asked, offering a practiced customer service smile. His name tag read, Tyler. Harlan pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and laid it on the counter. Need a wiring harness, fuel pressure regulator connector, for a 96 model 9500. He listed off the serial number of his engine from memory. Tyler turned to his dual monitor setup, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a rapid clicking rhythm. Harlan watched the kid's eyes dart across the screen. "Okay, let me see here," Tyler muttered. 96, 9500, fuel system. Harlan leaned against the counter, shifting his weight to take the pressure off his bad knee. "It's a standard 3-pin molded connector. Part number ought to start with RE." Tyler clicked his mouse a few times. The practiced smile faded slightly, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of corporate apology. "I see it here, sir, but it looks like we don't sell that subassembly on its own anymore." Harlan's jaw tightened. "What do you mean you don't sell it? It's a piece of plastic. It breaks all the time." "I understand that," Tyler said, his tone shifting into a rehearsed script. "But according to the new inventory guidelines, that specific connector is now integrated into the primary engine wiring harness block. We can't order just the plug. You'd have to buy the entire upper engine harness." Harlan stared at him. "The entire harness, for a severed 3-inch wire?" "Yes, sir." "And how much is the entire harness?" Tyler winced slightly before looking at the screen. "It lists for $1,240, plus freight." Harlan let out a low, scraping laugh. It wasn't funny, and it didn't sound amused. $1,200 to replace a $70 plug. "I'm sorry, sir. That's just what the system dictates." "Fine," Harlan said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational cadence. "I'll splice it myself. I just need the computer to recognize the fix. I patched it, but the ECU locked the engine. I need the bypass code. Give me the software unlock so I can clear the E104 code and run my machine." Tyler physically took a step back. "Oh, we can't do that. We absolutely cannot distribute diagnostic unlock codes to customers. It's against the terms of service." "Terms of service." Harlan echoed the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "I bought that combine in 1996, before you were born, Tyler. I paid cash. I own the steel, I own the engine, I own the tires." "You own the hardware, sir," Tyler corrected gently, clearly uncomfortable but strictly adhering to company policy. "But the software operating the engine is licensed. Any unauthorized modification to the emissions or fuel delivery systems triggers an automatic lockdown to prevent damage. To clear that code, we have to send a certified field technician out with the proprietary diagnostic tool." Harlan's hands slowly curled into fists resting on the clean synthetic counter. "And how much is it to have a tech drive out there and plug a laptop into my tractor for 2 minutes?" "Our field service rate is $250 an hour, including travel time," Tyler said, swallowing hard. "But we're backed up with harvest right now. I couldn't get a tech out to your farm until late next week. Thursday at the earliest." Harlan looked past Tyler, staring blankly at the wall behind the counter, lined with neatly organized, shrink-wrapped boxes. The rain was coming tomorrow. A week delay meant losing hundreds of bushels to moisture damage and stalk rot. It meant thousands of dollars lost. All because he wasn't allowed to fix a piece of plastic on a machine he had spent half his life operating. "So," Harlan said softly, the fight suddenly draining out of him, leaving only a cold, hollow cynicism. "You won't sell me the part. You want $1,200 for wires I don't need. And you won't let me fix it myself without paying you another $500 to send a man with a laptop a week from now. I wish I could do more, sir, really, but it's the policy." Harlan reached into his pocket and pulled out a rusted, heavy steel hex nut he'd found on the floorboard of his truck. He set it down gently on the pristine counter. The metal clinked sharply against the synthetic surface. 50 years, Harlan said, his voice quiet, devoid of anger, now just heavy with an exhausted finality. 50 years I bought green paint. Tell your manager he just sold his last drop. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned his back on the shiny tractors and the air-conditioned showroom, walking out into the graying morning, the weight of a dying era settling firmly squarely on his shoulders. Rain wasn't falling yet, but the air felt heavy, carrying the distinct bruised purple scent of a low-pressure system rolling in from the west. Harlan gripped the steering wheel of the Ford, his rough palms catching on the cracked vinyl cover. He didn't turn the radio back on. The silence inside the cab was thick, a vacuum created by the sudden violent death of his brand loyalty. 50 years. It felt like a physical mass pressing against his ribs, making it hard to draw a complete breath. He drove past his own turn off the gravel road leading back to the dead combine and kept heading south toward the county line. Calvin's Repair wasn't a dealership. It didn't have a paved lot or automatic sliding doors. It was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of oxidized iron and oil-stained dirt. Rusted husks of International harvesters and old Alice Chalmers tractors sat half swallowed by overgrown Johnson grass. Harlan pulled his truck up to the main shop, a massive pole barn made of corrugated tin that had faded from red to a dull, chalky pink. The smell hit him before he even stepped through the massive sliding doors, a pungent masculine mixture of burnt welding, flux, stale chewing tobacco, and gear oil. It was a smell that belonged to work, not commerce. Calvin was under a dismantled grain cart, only his heavy leather boots and grease-caked jeans visible. The deafening hiss and crackle of an arc welder echoed through the cavernous space, casting harsh, flickering blue shadows against the tin walls. Harlan stood patiently by a workbench cluttered with stripped bolts and empty cans of brake cleaner. He ran his thumb over the edge of a heavy cast-iron wrench, finding comfort in the cold, solid weight of it. There were no microchips in a wrench. The welding stopped. Calvin slid out from under the cart on a cracked wooden creeper. He was a bear of a man 15 years younger than Harlan, wearing a welder's cap backwards over a receding hairline. His safety glasses were heavily scratched, and his face was smeared with soot. "Harlan," Calvin grunted, wiping a massive forearm across his brow, leaving a new streak of grease behind. "Thought you were pushing to finish the North Quarter today. Storm's coming. Machine quit on me," Harlan said. His voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual quiet authority. He leaned against the workbench. Fuel pressure regulator connector sheared off. Wiring harness snapped right at the plug. Calvin pulled off his heavy leather gloves, slapping them against his thigh in a cloud of gray dust. 9000 series plastic got brittle vibrated right off the block. You know it. So patch it. Crimp some blue spades on there, wrap it tight, and get back in the field. Harlan looked down at his boots. "I did. Spliced it, taped it up. Starter cranked, but she wouldn't turn over. Threw an E104 code. Engine locked." Calvin stopped moving. The casual, easy demeanor vanished, replaced by a tight, rigid scowl. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a crushed pack of cigarettes, and lit one, taking a long, slow drag. The sharp smell of cheap tobacco smoke mixed with the ozone from the welder. "They locked you out," Calvin stated. It wasn't a question. "Went to town. To the new place." Harlan continued the words, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "Kid behind the counter said I had to buy a $1,200 wiring harness. said they couldn't just sell the plug anymore. And even if I bought it, they wouldn't give me the software code to unlock the engine. Wanted to send a tech out. Next Thursday. Calvin spat a fleck of tobacco onto the dirt floor. $250 an hour just to plug a proprietary tablet into your dash and hit the clear button. It's extortion, Harlan. I've been telling you this for 5 years. I know. Harlan rubbed his jaw, feeling the gray bristles of a missed morning shave. I don't have until next Thursday, Cal. That corn gets wet. The stalks are already weak from the rootworm this summer. A heavy wind and rain, it'll lay flat. I'll lose a quarter of the yield. Calvin took another drag, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the old farmer. He walked over to a battered metal toolbox, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a thick, reinforced Panasonic Toughbook. The plastic casing was scarred, and one of the rubber bumpers was missing. He set it on the workbench and booted it up. You know what this is? Calvin asked softly. Harlan shook his head. It's a cracked diagnostic interface. Some guys over in Ukraine figured out how to bypass the corporate firewalls on the engine control units. They sell the software on the dark web. I bought a copy 2 years ago. Calvin looked at Harlan, his expression dead serious. It voids every warranty you have left. And if the corporate boys find out I'm running it, they'll bury me in lawsuits so deep my grandkids will be paying legal fees. Harlan stared at the thick, rugged laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a crude, text-based interface that looked nothing like the slick-branded software at the dealership. It felt wrong. Harlan had spent his entire life playing by the rules. He paid his taxes, he paid his debts, and he respected the brands he did business with. Now he was standing in a dirty pole barn, contemplating digital piracy, just to harvest a crop he had planted with his own 2 hands on land his grandfather had cleared. I bought that combine in '96, Harlan said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. Paid $90,000 cash. It's my iron. It used to be, Calvin corrected gently. Now it's just a heavily financed computer with wheels. You just rent the right to turn the key. Calvin closed the laptop and picked it up. Grab a spool of good wire from the rack. We're going to bypass their harness, and then we're going to lie to their computer. Wind rattled the glass of the combine cab, a low moaning sound that preceded the heavy rain. Calvin sat in the operator's seat, hunched over the Toughbook. A thick aftermarket cable ran from the USB port of the laptop directly into the diagnostic port beneath the steering column. The faint blue glow of the screen illuminated the deep lines around Calvin's eyes and the tense set of his jaw. Harlan stood just outside the open cab door, standing on the metal platform. The air temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. He could smell the rain now, a wet, earthy scent kicking up from the dry soil miles away. Thunder rumbled low and deep in the west, vibrating through the steel grating under his boots. "How's it looking?" Harlan asked, having to raise his voice over the wind. "Just a second," Calvin muttered, his thick fingers tapping clumsily on the small keyboard. Lines of code scrolled down the screen-green text on a black background. "These newer firmware updates are aggressive. They build in backdoor checks. If I clear the code without suppressing the secondary sensor relay, it'll just lock down again the second the alternator engages." Harlan looked out over the field. 100 acres of dry golden corn waited in perfectly straight rows. The sky above them was a bruised, churning gray. He felt a deep, unfamiliar knot of anxiety in his stomach. It was the feeling of being a trespasser on his own property. He was sneaking around the digital back doors of a machine he had washed by hand, greased every single zerk fitting on, and bled over for decades. "All right," Calvin said, his breath hitching slightly. "I've bypassed the E104 flag. I told the computer that the fuel pressure regulator is receiving a factory standard voltage signal. Your tape job down there better hold Harlan. If that wire wiggles loose and shorts against the block again, the ECU might fry itself completely without the failsafe active." "It'll hold," Harlan said. He had wrapped it tight enough to stop a bleeding artery. Moment of truth. Calvin unhooked the diagnostic cable and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He slid out of the main operator's chair, gesturing for Harlan to take his place. "Turn the key. Don't touch the throttle yet. Just let the glow plugs warm up." Harlan climbed into the cab, his bad knee throbbing from the cold pressure drop. He settled into the familiar worn fabric of the seat. It molded perfectly to his spine. He reached for the ignition key. His hand was trembling slightly. He hadn't realized it until he saw his own thick, scarred knuckles shaking against the green plastic of the steering column. He turned the key, one click. The digital display on the corner post lit up. The harsh red E104 flashing warning was gone. In its place was the standard steady green glow of the engine hours and fuel gauge. Harlan held his breath. He turned the key the rest of the way. The heavy starter engaged. Rrr, 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 rrr. For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a thick plume of black diesel smoke belched from the exhaust stack right behind the cab. The massive engine roared to life, a deep guttural vibration that shook the entire machine. The familiar high-pitched whine of the turbocharger spooled up. It was a sound that had always brought Harlan a deep sense of satisfaction. It was the sound of harvest. But right now, sitting in the rattling cab, Harlan felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow exhaustion. Calvin slapped the side of the cab door. "She's alive!" he yelled over the roar of the diesel. "Get to cutting, old man. You got about 40 minutes before the sky falls." Harlan nodded, offering a tight, unsmiling nod of gratitude. Calvin climbed down the ladder and disappeared into the gray afternoon, walking back toward his truck, parked on the road. Harlan engaged the separator. The combine shuddered as the massive internal belts and pulleys caught traction. He lowered the corn head, the heavy steel snouts hovering inches above the dirt. He pushed the hydrostatic lever forward, and the machine chewed into the first row of stalks. The noise inside the cab was deafening. The stalks snapped violently against the gathering chains, the ears of corn thumping hard into the feeder house. Dust plumed up instantly, coating the windshield again. It was chaotic, violent, and perfectly rhythmic. 10 minutes later, the first drops of rain hit the glass. They were massive, heavy drops that splattered like insects against the dusty windshield. Harlan kept the throttle pinned. He watched the yield monitor, watching the grain flow into the hopper behind his head. The machine was performing flawlessly. His splice was holding. The engine was singing its familiar, powerful song. But as he gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the rows of corn disappearing beneath the spinning augers, the realization solidified in his chest like poured concrete. He didn't trust the machine anymore. Every time the engine lugged down slightly to chew through a thicker patch of corn, Harlan flinched, expecting the red lights to flash, expecting the computer to throw a fit and kill the engine, leaving him stranded again. The bond was broken. The partnership between man and iron had been severed, replaced by a hostage negotiation, mediated by lines of code he couldn't read, and a corporation that viewed him not as a partner, but as an endless revenue stream. The rain began to fall harder, turning the dust on the windshield into streaks of brown mud. Harlan flipped on the wipers. They smeared the grime back and forth, a repetitive squeaking metronome. He harvested well into the dark, long after the rain had turned the ground slick until the grain tank was full. He shut down the separator, letting the engine idle. He sat in the dark cab, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof. Tomorrow, he would finish the field. And the day after that, he was going to list the combine for sale. Gray light bled through the kitchen window, casting a flat, bruised pallor over the scarred oak table. Harlan sat motionless, nursing a ceramic mug of coffee that had gone tepid 20 minutes ago. His lower back screamed a dull, constant warning with every shallow breath. The joints in his fingers felt as though they were packed with crushed glass, swollen and stiff from gripping the combine steering wheel through the tense rain-soaked hours of the previous night. Harvesting in the mud always exacted a toll, but this morning the pain was different. It wasn't the satisfying ache of hard work completed. It was the hollow, grinding soreness of a man who realized he was fighting a war he had already lost. He set the mug down. The heavy silence of the farmhouse felt suffocating. He pushed himself up from the wooden chair, his knees popping in sharp protest, and limped toward the mudroom to pull on his boots. 10 minutes later, his truck idled at the edge of the north quarter. The rain had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of wet cement and a field of severed muddy corn stubble. Parked at the far end of the turn row sat the 9500. It looked like a wounded green beast. Brown mud coated the massive front drive tires, caked thick against the rims. Wet corn leaves were plastered to the side panels, and the windshield was an opaque smear of grime. For nearly 30 years, Harlan had looked at this machine and felt a deep, quiet surge of pride. He knew every grease zerk, every belt tensioner, every hidden grease trap. He remembered the smell of the cab the day they delivered it in '96, a sharp, clean scent of factory rubber and fresh paint. Now staring at it through the windshield of his Ford, he felt nothing but a cold, heavy estrangement. He killed the truck's engine and stepped out into the damp chill. The ground was soft, the mud sucking at the soles of his work boots with wet kissing sounds. He walked a slow circle around the combine. He stopped by the engine compartment, staring at the closed steel panel. Beneath that metal lay the bypass wire Calvin had spliced and the computer that had tried to hold his livelihood hostage. The machine had finished the harvest, yes, but only because they had lied to it. Harlan reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out his smartphone. It was an older model encased in a bulky black OtterBox, its screen cracked in the bottom left corner. He hated the device, using it mostly for checking radar maps and market prices. He swiped awkwardly at the screen with a thick, calloused thumb, opening the camera application. He framed the combine in the digital rectangle. The glare of the overcast sky washed out the green paint on the screen. He tapped the button. Click. He moved to the front, taking a picture of the corn head. Click. He climbed the metal ladder, his boots slipping slightly on the muddy rungs. He opened the cab door. The familiar smell hit him, a blend of stale dust, sun-baked vinyl, and old mouse bait. He sat in the operator's seat and took a photo of the dashboard, making sure the engine hours were visible on the green digital readout. 5,420 hours. A lot of life left in the iron. Every time the digital shutter clicked, it felt like a betrayal. Not a betrayal of the brand they had betrayed him first, but a betrayal of the history he shared with this specific assemblage of steel and rubber. He remembered his son, barely tall enough to see over the console, sitting on the buddy seat, holding a plastic thermos. He remembered eating cold meatloaf sandwiches in this cab during the drought of 2012, watching the dust devils tear across the dying crops. He climbed back down, his breathing heavy, and dialed a number he knew by heart. The phone rang 3 times before a booming voice answered. "Wade Auction Services, this is Wade." "Wade, it's Harlan Kessler." "Harlan, good to hear your voice, old man. How'd you weather the rain last night? Catch you in the field." "Caught me right at the end," Harlan said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual dry humor. "Got it all in the bins. Look, Wade, I need you to list a piece of equipment for the upcoming winter consignment sale." Papers rustled on the other end of the line. "All right, what are we clearing out?" "Finally getting rid of that rusty old grain cart." "No, I'm listing the 9,500. The line went dead quiet for 3 full seconds. The only sound was the distant hum of a semi-truck out on the county highway. "Your combine?" Wade finally asked, his booming voice dropping to a confused murmur. "Harlan, you love that machine. You just put new rasp bars in it 2 seasons ago. You retiring on me?" "I'm not retiring," Harlan said, shifting his weight, grimacing as a sharp pain shot up his hip. "I'm just done with green paint. I'm selling it." "Did it blow a rod? Throw a bearing through the block?" "Engine's fine. Runs strong." Harlan paused, looking at the muddy tires. "But I need to be straight with you, Wade. I had a wiring harness break yesterday. Dealership wouldn't sell me the plug. Tried to extort me for $1,200 and a week delay to send a tech to unlock the computer." Wade let out a low whistle. "They put the squeeze on you. I hear it every day, Harlan. It's criminal." Calvin bypassed it. Harlan confessed the words, tasting sour. "Used a cracked diagnostic tablet. Tricked the ECU into running. The fix is solid, but the software is black market. If whoever buys this takes it to a licensed dealer and plugs it in, the corporate boys will flag the serial number and brick the engine permanently." Wade sighed, a heavy scraping sound through the receiver. "Harlan, you know I can't hide that. I have to disclose a software bypass on the auction block, as is where is. With an unauthorized ECU flash, it's going to tank the resale value. Buyers get spooked. You might lose 20–30% of what the iron is actually worth." "I don't care," Harlan said. And to his surprise, he meant it. The anger had burned off, leaving only a cold, resolute clarity. "Sell it for what it brings. Let some guy who knows how to turn a wrench buy it cheap. I just want it off my farm." Frost crunched like crushed glass beneath the heavy tread of the combine's tires as Harlan eased it into the staging lot. It was mid-November, 2 weeks after the rainstorm. The air was bitterly cold, biting at exposed skin, and making the diesel engine sound sharper, more metallic in the thin atmosphere. Wade's auction yard was a sprawling 10-acre pasture, currently packed with rows of dead iron. Tractors, planters, balers, and tillage tools sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the gavel to dictate their futures. Harlan parked the 9,500 at the end of a row of much newer, shinier machines. Next to a massive $500,000 rotary combine with GPS domes and laser-guided steering, his 30-year-old machine looked like a relic from a forgotten century. He killed the engine for the last time. The silence in the cab was immediate and absolute. He spent 20 minutes thoroughly emptying the interior. He wasn't just cleaning, he was performing an exorcism. He pulled a rusted pair of fence pliers from beneath the seat. He found a handful of dried soybeans from 3 harvests ago nestled in the cup holder. He retrieved a faded, sweat-stained John Deere cap from the dash, looked at the embroidered logo for a long moment, and then tossed it into a plastic trash bag. As he wiped down the steering wheel with an oily rag, a shadow fell across the cab doorway. Harlan looked up. Standing on the metal platform was a man in his late 30s, wearing a worn Carhartt jacket and a bruised look of permanent exhaustion that Harlan recognized instantly. It was the look of a farmer trying to make ends meet on tight margins. Standing on the ladder behind him was a teenage boy shivering slightly in a thin hoodie. "Morning," the man said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "You the owner?" "I am," Harlan replied, tossing the dirty rag into a bucket. "For another 2 days, anyway." "Name's David. This is my boy Luke." The man extended a rough, calloused hand. Harlan shook it. The grip was firm, honest. "We're farming about 400 acres down in the southern part of the county, looking for a step-up machine. Our old gleaner finally cracked the frame." David looked over the dashboard, his eyes scanning the wear on the hydrostatic lever. "Listing says she's got 5,000 hours. Looks clean for her age. But Wade's tag out front has a red star on it. Says software bypass disclosure." "I wanted to hear it from the owner before I pull a bidding number." Harlan leaned back against the window glass. He could have played it down. He could have told David it was a minor glitch easily ignored. But looking at the dirt under David's fingernails and the eager, nervous way the teenage boy was staring at the controls, Harlan found he had no stomach for salesman games. Fuel pressure regulator plug snapped clean off the block. Harlan said, his voice flat and factual. "Brittle plastic. Corporate wanted me to buy a whole new harness for $1,200, then wait a week and pay a tech $500 just to type a password into the computer to let me start my own tractor." David's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. "So, you jumped it." "My mechanic spliced the wire. Strong crimp wrapped it tight. It's a good fix mechanically," Harlan explained, pointing down toward the floorboard. "But the computer locked me out. We had to use an unlicensed Ukrainian diagnostic tool to bypass the factory emissions flag and trick the ECU." Harlan met David's eyes directly. "It runs perfect, threshes clean. But I'm telling you right now, David, if you buy this machine, you can never let a dealership mechanic plug their laptop into this dash. The second it connects to their corporate mainframe, they'll see the unauthorized flash. They will lock the engine remotely, and they will void any right you have to buy parts from them." The teenager Luke looked alarmed. "They can just turn it off from town. They can," Harlan said to the boy, his tone softening slightly, "because they believe they own it even after you pay for it." David rubbed his bearded chin, staring thoughtfully at the steering column. He didn't look spooked. He looked calculating. "I do my own wrenching," David murmured. "Can't afford dealer shop rates anyway. Is the splice easy to reach if it rattles loose?" "Tight squeeze behind the air intake," Harlan said. "But you can get a pair of needle nose in there if you take off the side shield." David nodded, a slow, decisive movement. "I appreciate you being straight with me, Mr. Kessler. Most guys would just let the auctioneer mumble through the disclosure and hope nobody heard it." "No sense in passing a bad hand to another player," Harlan said. He reached into the storage compartment above his head and pulled out a thick, heavy 3-ring binder. The plastic cover was yellowed and cracked, smelling strongly of old paper and diesel exhaust. It was the original factory shop manual. He handed it to David. "There's no microchips in there," Harlan said quietly. "Just torque specs and belt diagrams. You'll need it." David took the heavy manual, holding it against his chest. "Thank you. I'll be bidding on Friday." Harlan gathered his trash bag and his thermos. He climbed down the ladder, the freezing wind cutting through his denim jacket. He didn't look back at the green machine as he walked across the frost-heaved gravel lot toward his truck. His hands were empty, His pockets felt light, and a bitter wind was blowing from the north. He had no combine, and come spring, he'd have to figure out how to farm without the brand that had defined his entire life. But as he opened the door to his rusty Ford, a strange, terrifying sense of lightness settled over him. He had lost a fortune in resale value, but for the first time in 30 years, the corporation wasn't riding in the cab with him. January winds howled off the flat frozen plains, driving dry snow against the aluminum siding of Harlan's machine shed. Inside, the cavernous space felt unnervingly hollow. For the first time in 30 years, the massive bay where the green 9500 used to sit was empty, occupied only by an oil stain on the concrete and a lingering ghost-like scent of diesel. Harlan stood in the center of the cold shed, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his insulated Carhartt coveralls. He needed a combine. Spring planting was still months away, but a farmer without a harvester was just a man with a very expensive lawn. He didn't go back to Prairie Ag Solutions. He didn't look at any brand new iron. Instead, he drove 2 hours east across the state line to a place called Henderson's Implement and Salvage. It wasn't a dealership. It was a sprawling graveyard of obsolete agricultural history run by an eccentric mechanic named Greg Henderson, who specialized in rebuilding pre-emission mechanically injected tractors. Gravel crunched under Harlan's boots as he walked the rows of faded red, yellow, and silver machines. The sky was the color of a bruised knee, low and heavy with snow. He stopped in front of a 1989 Case International 166. The red paint had chalked under decades of brutal sun, fading to a dull, flat pink. The white cab top was stained with rust from a dented exhaust pipe. It lacked the sleek modern curves of the newer machines. It was a blunt brutalist box of heavy steel and right angles. Greg walked up beside him, a thermos of black coffee in one hand. He was a short, wiry man with a face cured like saddle leather and hands perpetually stained with oil. "She ain't pretty," Greg rasped, taking a sip from the plastic cup. "But she's honest, pure mechanical Cummins engine under the hood. No computer, no emissions software. Hell, she barely has fuses." Harlan reached out his thick gloved fingers, tracing the cold steel of the unloader auger. It felt different than the Deere. Less refined, heavier. "How many hours?" Clock stopped working at 4,000. Greg admitted, offering a dry, rattling laugh. "I figure she's got closer to 6, but I pulled the rotor last month, put in new elephant ears, reflighted the transition cone, rebuilt the injection pump. She'll burn dirty, she'll vibrate your fillings loose, but she won't ever tell you no." Harlan opened the cab door. The hinges shrieked in the cold air. He climbed the ladder, the rungs narrower and steeper than he was used to. He slid into the operator's seat. It was a severe downgrade. The seat was covered in a scratchy brown vinyl that had split at the seams, revealing yellow foam. The steering wheel was hard plastic, worn smooth at the 10 and 2 positions. Instead of a sleek digital console, the dashboard was a utilitarian array of analog gauges with vibrating analog needles, water temp, oil pressure, battery voltage. A row of heavy toggle switches controlled the separator and header. There were no microchips here. There was no proprietary software locking him out of the fuel system. It was just switches, wires, and relays. He wrapped his hands around the cold steering wheel. The cab smelled of old mouse nests, stale chewing gum, and dust that had settled during the Reagan administration. It lacked the ergonomic perfection he had grown accustomed to over 3 decades. His back flared in protest at the stiff angle of the seat. He knew with absolute certainty that spending 12 hours a day in this box would physically break him down faster than the green machine ever did. "You're a green paint guy," Greg said, standing on the platform outside the open door, watching Harlan's internal calculation. "I see guys like you come over here sometimes. You get mad at the corporate boys, you buy an old red mechanical rig to stick it to them. Then you run it for one season, remember how much your spine hurts without an air ride seat, and you go crawling back to the dealership." Harlan stared out the dirty windshield at the gray, frozen yard. He thought about Tyler, the soft-handed kid at the parts counter, calmly explaining that a $70 piece of plastic required a $1,200 harness. He thought about the red E104 code flashing on the screen, holding his crop hostage. "Not this time," Harlan said softly. His voice sounded remarkably steady in the quiet cab. "I don't care if it rides like a buckboard wagon. I just want to turn a wrench and have the machine actually listen to me." He climbed down from the cab, landing heavily on the frozen gravel. His bad knee sent a sharp, bright spike of pain up his thigh. He ignored it. He walked to the back of the case, inspecting the sieves, running his bare hand over the rusty metal, feeling for cracks or weak welds. It was primitive. It was a step backward in time, a rejection of the precision agriculture that was defining the modern farming era. But as he stood there in the bitter wind, surrounded by aging iron, the crushing weight of helplessness that had haunted him since autumn finally began to lift. He wasn't renting a license anymore. He was buying a tool. "I'll write you a check," Harlan said, turning back to Greg. "Deliver it next week and throw in an extra box of shear pins. I have a feeling I'm going to need them." Greg grinned, a flash of white against the engine grease on his face. "Welcome to the resistance, old man." July brought a heat wave that baked the moisture out of the topsoil, turning the county roads into ribbons of choking white dust. Harlan sat in the cab of the red 1660, the air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the 95-degree sun, baking the metal roof. Sweat stung his eyes, pooling in the deep creases of his weathered face. His denim shirt clung to his back, damp and uncomfortable. He was cutting winter wheat. The golden head shattered violently against the cutter bar, a continuous deafening roar of mechanical violence. Greg hadn't lied. The case vibrated with a raw, unrefined aggression. Harlan felt every heavy lug of the Cummins engine vibrating up through the floorboards and directly into his deteriorating spine. Dust leaked past the worn rubber seals of the cab door, leaving a gritty film on his teeth. The hydro lever was stiff, requiring a forceful shove to adjust his speed. It was an exhausting, brutal machine to operate. He missed the whisper-quiet cab of his old 9500. He missed the precise laser-guided yield monitor. He missed the air ride seat that floated over the rough furrows. But as the grain tank filled with hard red winter wheat, a different sensation settled in his chest. A profound, unyielding sense of ownership. Midway through the afternoon, the temperature cresting near 100 degrees, disaster struck. Harlan was pushing the combine through a particularly thick patch of down wheat when a loud explosive bang echoed from the right side of the machine. The cab shuddered violently. The heavy rhythmic hum of the separator died, instantly replaced by the terrifying sound of free-spinning metal and grinding chains. Harlan slammed the hydrostatic lever back to neutral. He didn't panic. He just killed the separator switch, letting the massive engine idle down. No alarms blared. No digital screen flashed a proprietary error code telling him to call a dealer. There was just silence, save for the low rumble of the diesel exhaust. He grabbed his leather gloves from the dash, his joints popping as he climbed down the steep ladder into the suffocating heat of the wheat field. The smell of hot metal and scorched rubber was thick in the air. He waded through the sharp, scratchy wheat stubble to the right side of the machine and unlatched the heavy side shield. It swung upward, revealing the complex, chaotic arrangement of belts and pulleys that drove the internal rotor. There it was. The main drive belt, a massive band of reinforced rubber thicker than his forearm, had snapped clean in half. The broken ends hung limply across the dirty pulleys, smelling of burnt friction. A decade ago, breaking a main drive belt would have ruined his afternoon. Now standing in the sweltering field, sweat dripping from his nose onto his dusty boots, Harlan let out a short, genuine bark of laughter. It was just rubber. He walked to the toolbox mounted by the fuel tank. He didn't need a diagnostic laptop. He didn't need a firmware update. He needed a 3/4-inch wrench and a crowbar. He wrestled the broken belt off the pulleys, his hands instantly coated in black dust and hot grease. He tossed the ruined rubber onto the ground. He climbed into his Ford truck, left idling at the end of the field, and drove into town. He didn't go to the sleek, air-conditioned corporate dealership. He went to the local Napa auto parts store. A bell dinged as he walked in the smell of fresh rubber and floor wax hitting his nose. He dropped the heavy broken belt onto the worn laminate counter. An older man named Tom, wearing a faded blue smock, peered over his reading glasses. Rotor belt for a case. 1660. Harlan grunted, wiping a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. Tom disappeared into the back room for 3 minutes. He returned carrying a stiff black heavy-duty belt coiled like a massive snake. Got one left, $180. Harlan paid cash. No software licenses, no serial number tracking, no terms of service. An hour later, Harlan was back in the dirt. The sun beat down relentlessly on his neck. His lower back screamed as he leaned into the engine compartment, using the crowbar to compress the massive spring-loaded tensioner. His muscles trembled with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The heavy belt fought him stiff and unyielding. The crowbar slipped, and Harlan's knuckles slammed hard into a rusty steel bracket. Blood welled up bright red against the black grease on his hand. The pain was sharp and immediate. Harlan swore a harsh guttural sound that vanished into the vast emptiness of the wheat field. He didn't stop. He wiped the blood on his jeans, reset the crowbar, and threw his entire body weight against the tensioner. With a final agonizing push, he slipped the thick belt over the top pulley. It snapped into the groove perfectly. Harlan collapsed back into the dirt, sitting in the sharp wheat stubble, his chest heaving. His hand was throbbing, his back was locked in a tight spasm, and he was covered in a filthy mixture of sweat chaff and blood. He looked like a man who had just lost a fistfight. He dragged himself up off the ground, closed the side panel, and climbed back into the cab. He turned the key. The analog gauges flickered. He hit the separator switch. The heavy drive belt engaged with a solid, reassuring thud. The machine shook, and the mechanical roar of the rotor spooled up loud, violent, and perfectly steady. Harlan grabbed the hydro lever and pushed it forward. The case lurched back into the standing wheat, chewing through the stalks, spitting chaff into the hot July wind. His knuckles stung, his spine ached, and his ears rang from the noise. It was the hardest he had worked in years. But as he watched the golden grain pouring into the hopper behind his head, Harlan smiled a tight, genuine, tired smile. The blood on the steering wheel was his. The machine was his. And the harvest finally belonged to him alone. Frost rimmed the edges of the case's windshield, forming a delicate crystalline crust against the peeling red paint. Harlan steered the 1660 through the final acres of the North Quarter. It was late November, exactly 1 year, almost to the day, since the green machine had died in this exact field and taken his blind loyalty down with it. The old red combine was actively punishing him. The heater core was partially clogged, offering only a weak, lukewarm breath against the freezing glass, meaning Harlan was wearing heavy insulated coveralls and a thick wool beanie inside the cab. The steering column had a 2-inch dead zone, forcing him to constantly saw at the hard plastic wheel to keep the snouts of the header aligned with the dry corn rows. His lower back was a tight radiating knot of pure unadulterated agony. He was chewing ibuprofen like candy just to get his boots on in the mornings. Yet, as the heavy ears of corn snapped against the gathering chains and the golden kernels cascaded into the hopper behind his head, Harlan felt a profound, untouchable calm. He reached the end of the row, pulling the stiff hydrostatic lever back to neutral. He engaged the unloading auger, swinging the heavy metal spout over the side of his idling semi-truck. The dried corn rushed out in a deafening metallic roar, kicking up a thick cloud of sweet earthy dust that smelled of autumn and hard work. He watched the grain pile high in the trailer, noting the deep golden color and the lack of cracked kernels. The case was a blunt instrument, but he had spent the last 3 weeks dialing in the concave clearances with a pair of wrenches. He had tuned it by ear, listening to the pitch of the rotor, feeling the vibration through the floorboards until it ran perfectly. When the trailer was full, he shut down the combine, the heavy Cummins engine, coughing once before dying into a heavy silence. He climbed down the steep ladder, his bad knee screaming in protest as his boots hit the frozen uneven dirt. He limped over to the semi, climbed into the cab, and put the truck in gear. The line at the Prairie Valley Co-op elevator stretched a half-mile down the county highway. A convoy of diesel trucks sat idling air brakes, hissing exhaust stacks, puffing white clouds into the flat gray sky. Harlan pulled his rusty Ford Louisville into the back of the line, set the parking brake, and poured a cup of black coffee from his dented steel thermos. He watched the machines ahead of him. The line was a parade of modern agricultural wealth. Massive brand-new semi-tractors pulling polished aluminum hoppers. Parked across the highway in the staging fields were the machines that filled them sleek $500,000 combines with GPS domes mounted like crowns on their roofs, boasting flawless paint and pristine climate-controlled cabs. A sharp rap on his driver's side window startled him. Harlan rolled down the manual crank window. Standing in the freezing wind was Wyatt, a younger farmer, whose land bordered Harlan's to the east. Wyatt farmed 3,000 acres. He was 35, perpetually sunburned, and currently looked like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. "How's the Red Menace treating you, Harlan?" Wyatt asked, his voice tight. He sparked a lighter, his hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. The sharp smell of cheap tobacco cut through the diesel fumes. "She's loud," Harlan grunted, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "She rides rough, but she threshes clean." Wyatt let out a long, ragged exhale, staring out over the line of trucks. The dark circles under his eyes looked bruised. "My S-Series threw a DEF system code an hour ago. Sensor thinks the exhaust fluid pressure is running a fraction of a volt too low. Computer derated the engine down to a forced idle. I've got 3 trucks sitting empty, a crew on the clock, and snow forecasted for tomorrow." Harlan rested his forearms on the cold steering wheel. He didn't gloat. He didn't feel any vindication at the younger man's misery. He just felt a deep, heavy pang of empathy. He remembered that exact feeling, the cold, suffocating paralysis of waiting for permission to do your own job. "Service truck coming," Harlan asked quietly. "Dealership says they can flash the code over the air," Wyatt muttered, rubbing his forehead with a dirty, grease-stained hand. "But the corporate server is down for maintenance. They can't ping my tractor. They told me to leave the key on and wait for the signal." Wyatt looked up, his eyes meeting Harlan's. The younger man looked utterly defeated. "I owe the bank $2 million on my equipment note, Harlan, and I'm standing in a frozen ditch begging a satellite to let me harvest my own corn." Harlan didn't offer any empty advice. There was nothing to say. He simply reached out and clapped a heavy, calloused hand on Wyatt's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze before rolling the window back up to keep the bitter wind out. An hour later, Harlan pulled his truck over the graded scales. The massive hydraulic lifts caught the front of the trailer, tilting it upward. The corn rushed out a golden waterfall, plunging into the dark, echoing pit of the elevator. The dust plumed, coating the windshield, smelling of dry starch and soil. The weighmaster slid a printed paper ticket through the pneumatic tube. Harlan looked at the numbers. Weight, moisture, content, test weight. Real tangible metrics. No error codes. No software locks. Just the pure, unadulterated sum of a year's labor. The sun was dropping below the horizon by the time he parked the semi back in his machine shed, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the gravel drive. He walked over to the red combine, its metal ticking faintly as it cooled in the encroaching dark. He reached in, grabbed his empty thermos, and firmly shut the heavy cab door. He stood there for a long moment, the freezing wind biting at his cheeks. His body was breaking down. He knew with cynical certainty that he would likely need a knee replacement before the spring thaw. He was tired in a way that went straight to the marrow of his bones, a deep, grinding exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. But as he turned his back on the old iron and began the slow, limping walk toward the farmhouse, the silence of the property no longer felt like a hostage situation. It didn't feel like a taunt. His hands were battered, his back was ruined, and his machinery was obsolete. Yet as the first flakes of winter snow began to fall, settling quietly onto the frozen dirt, Harlan Kessler breathed in the cold night air and smiled. He was finally entirely his own man again,